After 10 years of ignoring me, they had the nerve to show up at my mansion. I opened the door, spoke calmly, and watched the color drain from their faces. The marble floors of my foyer gleamed under the crystal chandelier as I heard the intercom chime from the front gate. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, the kind where golden light streams through expensive windows and makes everything look like a magazine spread. I wasn't expecting anyone. My housekeeper Maria had the weekend off, and my usual circle of friends knew better than to drop by unannounced. I set down my cup of Earl Grey and walked to the security panel, checking the camera feed. Through the high-definition screen, I could see 3 figures standing at my gate. Something about their postures seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. I pressed the intercom button. Yes? Sarah? It's Jessica. Jessica Martinez. We were hoping we could talk to you. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed the gate release and walked to the front door, my heels clicking against the imported Italian stone. Standing before me were 3 people I hadn't seen in exactly 10 years and 4 months. Not that I was counting. Jessica Martinez, my former best friend since kindergarten. She looked older now, with worry lines around her eyes and cheaper highlights than she used to get at that salon on Fifth Avenue. Her designer knockoff purse hung awkwardly from her shoulder, and I could tell she was trying not to stare at the marble columns framing my entrance. Next to her stood Marcus Thompson, the guy I'd dated for 2 years in college before he decided I wasn't ambitious enough for his future plans. His hair was thinning now, and he developed a paunch that his ill-fitting suit couldn't quite hide. The confidence he'd once carried like armor seemed diminished somehow. And finally, there was Rebecca Walsh, Jessica's younger sister, who'd been part of our tight-knit group until everything fell apart. She clutched a worn leather purse and kept glancing between me and the circular driveway where my Tesla and Mercedes were parked. "Hello, Sarah," Jessica said, her voice smaller than I remembered. "We were hoping we could talk to you." I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. These 3 people who had systematically cut me out of their lives, who had made me feel like I was nothing, who had ignored my calls and texts and emails until I finally stopped trying. They were here, at my mansion in the Hollywood Hills, looking nervous and out of place. "Well," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "this is certainly unexpected." The last time I'd seen any of them was at Marcus's engagement party 10 years and 4 months ago. I just graduated from UCLA with my computer science degree, while everyone else seemed to have their lives figured out. Jessica was working at a prestigious marketing firm, Rebecca had landed a job at a high-end gallery, and Marcus was climbing the corporate ladder at his father's investment company. I remember wearing a dress from Target to that party, feeling completely out of place among their designer clothes and talk of expensive vacations. When I tried to tell them about my ideas for a tech startup, about the app I was developing in my spare time, they'd listened with polite disinterest before changing the subject. That night, I overheard Jessica talking to Marcus by the bar. "Sarah's sweet," she'd said, "but she's living in a fantasy world. This whole tech entrepreneur thing is just unrealistic. She needs to get a real job instead of chasing pipe dreams." Marcus had nodded, swirling his whiskey. "She's always been the dreamer in the group. Some people just aren't meant for success, you know. She'll figure it out eventually and settle for something more appropriate." Rebecca had joined them then, giggling. "Remember when she said she was going to be the next Steve Jobs? At least she makes us look good by comparison." They'd all laughed, and something inside me had broken. These were supposed to be my closest friends, the people who knew me better than anyone. But they saw me as a failure before I'd even really tried. I left the party early and spent the next few months trying to maintain our friendships. I called Jessica to make lunch plans, but she was always too busy with work or other friends. I texted Marcus about getting coffee, but he'd read my messages and never respond. Rebecca would post pictures on social media of the 3 of them hanging out without me, and when I finally asked Jessica about it, she claimed they'd just run into each other, and didn't think to invite me. The final straw came 6 months later when I found out through mutual acquaintances that Marcus was getting married. Not engaged, married. The wedding had already happened, a small ceremony in Napa Valley that apparently included Jessica and Rebecca as guests. I hadn't even known he was dating anyone seriously. When I confronted Jessica about it, she'd been cold and dismissive. "Sarah, we're all in different places in our lives now. Marcus didn't think you'd be interested in coming anyway. You've been so focused on your little app thing." That was the last real conversation we'd had. Now, standing in the doorway of my $6 million home, I watched as Jessica shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. Marcus kept glancing at the security cameras I had installed, probably wondering if this conversation was being recorded. Rebecca seemed fascinated by the fountain in my front yard, her eyes wide with something that looked like regret. "How did you find my address?" I asked, genuinely curious. I'd been very careful about my privacy since my company went public. "We looked up public property records," Jessica admitted. "It took some research, but we found the LLC that owns this place and traced it back to you. This made me smile slightly. Property records. Old school detective work. What exactly is it that you want? Marcus stepped forward, his old salesman smile appearing but looking forced. Sarah, we know it's been a long time, and we want to apologize for how things ended between us. We were young and stupid, and we made mistakes. Mistakes, I repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting way to put it. The truth was, after they cut me out of their lives, I'd thrown myself completely into my work. My app, which they'd all dismissed as a pipe dream, was a productivity tool that used AI to help small businesses manage their workflows. I'd spent 18-hour days coding, living on ramen and determination in a studio apartment in North Hollywood. The first version was rough, but it worked. A few small businesses tried it and loved it. Word spread slowly through online communities and tech forums. I iterated and improved, adding features and fixing bugs based on user feedback. 2 years after that engagement party, my app was featured in TechCrunch. 6 months later, I had 100,000 users. 18 months after that, I was acquired by Microsoft for $42 million. But I didn't stop there. I used that money to start a new company, this time focusing on cybersecurity solutions for small and medium businesses. The timing was perfect, data breaches were becoming a major concern, but most security software was either too expensive or too complicated for smaller companies. My second company grew steadily over the next 6 years. We went public 2 years ago, and my stake was worth over $200 million. I'd also made smart investments in real estate and other tech startups. Forbes had put me on their self-made women under 35 list just last year. Throughout all of this success, I'd occasionally wondered what my old friends were doing. Social media made it easy to keep tabs on people, even when they weren't talking to you anymore. Jessica had been laid off from her marketing job during the 2020 recession and was now working at a much smaller firm for half the salary. Marcus's father's investment company had been investigated for fraud, and while Marcus wasn't personally implicated, his career had suffered. He was now working as a mid-level financial advisor at a regional bank. Rebecca's gallery had closed during the pandemic, and she was now teaching art classes at a community college while running weekend workshops for local artists. None of them were doing badly, exactly, but their lives hadn't turned out the way they'd planned. Meanwhile, I was living in a mansion with a view of the entire city, dating a successful architect named David Chen, and running a company that employed over 800 people. We saw the article about you in Fortune last month, Rebecca said quietly. The one about your new cybersecurity initiative with schools. So that's what had prompted this visit. The article had been particularly flattering, complete with photos of my home office and a sidebar about my meteoric rise in the tech world. The journalist had specifically mentioned how I'd started with nothing and built my empire through sheer determination and innovative thinking. It was a nice article, I agreed. Very thorough. Jessica cleared her throat. Sarah, we want you to know that we're proud of what you've accomplished. We always knew you were smart and capable. This time I couldn't hide my smile. Did you? Because I distinctly remember being told that I was living in a fantasy world and chasing pipe dreams. The color drained from Jessica's face. Marcus looked down at his shoes. Rebecca's mouth fell open slightly. You heard that conversation, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I did. Among others. You three weren't exactly subtle about your feelings regarding my unrealistic career goals. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling completely relaxed for the first time since opening the door. This was actually quite therapeutic. Look, I continued, I understand why you're here. You've fallen on relatively hard times, and you've seen that your old friend Sarah, the one who was never meant for success, is now worth more than all of your net worths combined. You're hoping that a sincere apology and some rekindled friendship might lead to what? Investment opportunities? Job offers? A loan? It's not like that, Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Jessica, your marketing firm is struggling. I know because I looked into possibly hiring them for our new product launch. Your client list is half what it used to be, and your biggest account is threatening to leave. Marcus, I heard through industry contacts that you're having trouble making your mortgage payments since the divorce. And Rebecca, community college teaching pays what, $40,000 a year? They stared at me with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. I'd done my homework, of course. When you have money and connections, information becomes very easy to obtain. How do you know all that? Marcus asked. The same way I know about your father's SEC settlement, Jessica's mother's medical bills, and Rebecca's student loan debt that she defaulted on last year. I make it my business to know about people who were once important to me. This was partially true. I did keep tabs on them through social media and mutual connections, but I'd only done the deeper research after seeing them on my doorstep. A few phone calls to the right people had filled in the details I needed. We made mistakes, Sarah, Jessica said again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. We were jealous and competitive and we treated you terribly. We're sorry. We're genuinely sorry. Are you sorry that you treated me badly, or are you sorry that you were wrong about me? The question hung in the air between us. A cool October breeze rustled through the palm trees lining my driveway, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hum of traffic on the highway below. Both, Rebecca said quietly. We were horrible friends, and we were wrong about everything. I studied her face, looking for sincerity. Rebecca had always been the most genuine of the three, even when she was going along with the others' cruelty. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. Do you remember what you said about me making you look good by comparison? I asked her. She winced. Yes. And now? Now I think we made ourselves look bad by comparison to you. We always did. This was more honesty than I'd expected from any of them. Marcus and Jessica were still looking uncomfortable and calculating, but Rebecca seemed genuinely remorseful. Sarah, Marcus said, stepping closer to the door, we know we have no right to ask this, but we're all going through some tough times right now. If there's any way you could help us. Help you how? Maybe. Job opportunities at your company? Or investment advice? Or. He trailed off, apparently realizing how transparent this sounded. I looked at the three of them standing on my doorstep like supplicants at a temple, and I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. These people who had made me feel so small and worthless were now begging for scraps from my table. The memory hit me suddenly, the night after Marcus's engagement party, sitting on the floor of my cramped studio apartment in North Hollywood, surrounded by code printouts and empty energy drink cans. I called my mom in Ohio, sobbing into the phone about how my friends didn't believe in me anymore. Sweetheart, she'd said in that patient voice she used when I was being dramatic, sometimes people can only see as far as their own limitations allow. That doesn't mean you have to accept those limitations as your own. At the time, I thought she was just being a supportive parent, saying the kind of thing mothers are supposed to say when their children are hurting. But standing here now, watching three people who had once seemed so much more successful than me fumble for words, I realized she'd been giving me the key to everything. Those early years after college had been brutal in ways I'd almost forgotten. Not just because of their rejection, but because of the sheer difficulty of building something from nothing. I'd worked as a freelance web developer during the day to pay rent, then spent my nights and weekends coding my productivity app. My social life had evaporated, partly because Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had frozen me out, but mostly because I simply didn't have time for anything except work. There were months when I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and instant ramen because every spare dollar went into my business. I remember one particularly low point where my laptop died and I couldn't afford to replace it immediately. I spent 3 weeks coding on the ancient desktop computer at the local library, staying until they kicked me out at closing time. The librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, had eventually asked me what I was working on. When I explained my app idea, she'd looked skeptical, not mean-spirited like my former friends, but genuinely concerned that I was wasting my time. Mija, she'd said, maybe you should focus on finding a stable job first. This computer stuff is very risky. Even well-meaning people couldn't see what I was building. But that's when I learned one of the most important lessons of my life: vision is a lonely gift. Most people can only understand success after it's already happened, not while it's being created. I thought about Marcus's sneer when I'd mentioned wanting to change the world through technology. Everyone thinks they're going to be the next Silicon Valley success story, he'd said. The reality is that 90% of startups fail. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. What he hadn't understood was that I wasn't afraid of failure, I was terrified of regret. The idea of looking back at my life and wondering what if was far more frightening than the possibility of trying and failing. The irony was that Marcus, who'd seemed so practical and sensible, had actually taken a bigger risk. He'd bet his entire future on his father's company continuing to thrive, on the old boys network continuing to protect him, on the world staying exactly as it was. When his father's firm collapsed under investigation, Marcus had no backup plan, no skills that translated to other industries, no network outside of his father's tainted circle. I, meanwhile, had been building something that could survive and thrive regardless of economic downturns or industry changes. Every line of code I wrote, every user problem I solved, every investor meeting I endured, all of it had been creating value that no one could take away from me. Jessica shifted nervously on my doorstep, and I remembered another painful moment from those early years. I'd run into her at a Starbucks in Beverly Hills, about 6 months after Marcus's engagement party. She'd been with 2 women I didn't recognize, both impeccably dressed and carrying designer bags. "Sarah," she'd said, with a kind of fake enthusiasm that makes your stomach turn. "How are you? Still working on your little app?" The dismissive way she'd said little app had stung more than an outright insult. It was the verbal equivalent of patting me on the head and telling me I was cute for trying. Actually, we just hit 10,000 users, I'd said, trying to keep the pride out of my voice. One of her friends had laughed. 10,000? That's adorable. Jessica, didn't you say your marketing campaign last month reached 2 million people? Jessica had looked uncomfortable but hadn't corrected the implication that my achievement was somehow less valid than hers. Different industries, she'd said with a shrug. Sarah's always been more of a niche person. Niche. As if building something specific and useful was somehow inferior to creating generic marketing content that would be forgotten within a week. That conversation had haunted me for months. Not because of the casual cruelty, I was getting used to that, but because part of me had wondered if they were right. Maybe 10,000 users wasn't impressive. Maybe I was deluding myself about the potential of what I was building. It wasn't until my user base hit 100,000, then 500,000, then finally caught the attention of Microsoft, that I realized the real difference between Jessica and me. She measured success and reach, how many people saw her work. I measured success and impact, how many people's lives were genuinely improved by what I created. Her campaigns might have reached millions, but they were designed to be forgotten as soon as people made their purchases. My app was designed to become an indispensable part of people's daily routines, to solve real problems and create lasting value. When Microsoft acquired my company, the head of their small business division told me something I'd never forgotten: most entrepreneurs build products for themselves and hope other people will want them. You built a product for other people and made it so good that you wanted to use it yourself. That's the difference between a vanity project and a real business. Rebecca, the youngest of my former friends, had perhaps hurt me the most because I genuinely cared about her opinion. She'd been an art major, someone I'd thought would understand the creative process, the vulnerability of putting your work out into the world and hoping people would see its value. But when she'd made that comment about me making them look good by comparison, she'd revealed something ugly about her character. She didn't want to succeed as much as she wanted others to fail. She was more interested in being better than her friends than in actually being good at anything. I'd seen this pattern play out in her life over the years through social media. She'd get excited about other people's failures, former classmates who didn't get into graduate school, colleagues who got laid off, mutual acquaintances whose relationships ended. She had a hunger for other people's misfortune that I found deeply disturbing. When her gallery job ended during the pandemic, I'd actually felt bad for her. Despite everything, I didn't wish professional failure on any of them. But I'd noticed that her social media posts had become increasingly bitter, filled with rants about privilege and unfair advantages and how real artists were being pushed out by tech money and Instagram culture. She'd never acknowledged that her gallery had failed not because of outside forces, but because she'd been more interested in looking down on potential customers than in actually selling art. I'd heard from mutual acquaintances that she developed a reputation for being condescending to anyone who didn't already know everything about contemporary art theory. The community college teaching job she'd eventually taken was probably the best thing that could have happened to her, though I doubted she saw it that way. Working with students who genuinely wanted to learn might force her to remember why she'd supposedly loved art in the first place. Now, looking at all three of them fidgeting on my doorstep, I could see how their fundamental character flaws had shaped their declining fortunes. Marcus's arrogance had made him overconfident and unprepared for setbacks. Jessica's superficiality had left her without deep skills or meaningful relationships. Rebecca's bitterness had poisoned her ability to collaborate or inspire others. Meanwhile, every challenge I'd faced had made me stronger, more resourceful, more determined. When investors rejected my pitches, I'd learned to pitch better. When users complained about bugs, I'd learned to code more carefully. When competitors emerged, I'd learned to innovate faster. The success I'd built wasn't just about having good ideas, it was about having the resilience to execute those ideas despite constant obstacles and criticism. It was about believing in myself when no one else would, about working harder than everyone around me, about treating failures as education rather than defeat. 10 years ago, I would have done anything to have their approval and friendship back. I cried myself to sleep more nights than I cared to remember, wondering what was wrong with me that my closest friends could so easily discard me. But now, seeing them desperate and diminished, I realized I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd found it within myself and in the success I'd built from their rejection. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," I said, my voice still perfectly calm. "You're going to leave my property, and you're not going to contact me again. You're not going to hire any more private investigators to find me, and you're not going to show up at my office or any events I might attend." "Sarah, please," Jessica started. "I'm not finished. You three made a choice 10 years ago to exclude me from your lives because you thought I was a loser with unrealistic dreams. That choice has consequences. You don't get to undo it now that those dreams have made me rich." I paused, watching their faces carefully. Marcus looked angry now, his jaw clenched. Jessica was crying openly. Rebecca just looked resigned. However, I continued, I'm not completely heartless. Rebecca, you mentioned that you're teaching art classes at community college. There's a program my foundation runs that provides art supplies and equipment to underfunded schools. If you're genuinely interested in helping kids and not just looking for a handout, send me a proposal through the official channels. Don't mention our history. Let your work speak for itself. Rebecca's eyes widened with surprise and hope. What about us? Marcus demanded. You're really going to leave us hanging after everything we meant to each other? I laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Everything we meant to each other? Marcus, you dumped me because you said I wasn't ambitious enough. Now you're asking for my help because I turned out to be more ambitious than you ever dreamed. The irony is pretty spectacular. People change, Sarah. We've all grown up since then. Have you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've just gotten desperate. I stepped back and began to close the door. Goodbye, Jessica. Goodbye, Marcus. Rebecca, I meant what I said about the proposal. Wait. Jessica called out. Sarah, we were friends for 15 years. Doesn't that count for something? I paused with my hand on the door. You know what counts for something? The fact that for the past 10 years, I've been building something amazing, and none of you were there to support me or share in it. That's not my loss anymore, it's yours. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, then walked to the window to watch them leave. They stood on my doorstep for another few minutes, having what looked like a heated discussion. Marcus was gesticulating angrily while Jessica wiped her eyes with a tissue. Rebecca just stared at the door like she was hoping I might change my mind and open it again. Finally, they walked back to their car, a beat-up Honda that looked out of place in my circular driveway. As they drove away, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I dreamed of this moment for years, imagining all the things I would say to them if I ever got the chance. But now that it had happened, it felt somewhat hollow. My phone buzzed with a text from David. How was your afternoon? Still coming to dinner with my parents tonight? I smiled and typed back, afternoon was interesting. Tell you about it later. Looking forward to the dumplings. David's parents were lovely people who had welcomed me warmly into their family. His mother, Dr. Linda Chen, was a pediatric surgeon who admired my foundation's work with children's education, something I'd started 3 years ago after realizing I wanted to give back to communities that lacked resources for STEM programs. His father, Robert, was a retired literature professor who enjoyed our discussions about everything from business ethics to science fiction novels. They treated me like the successful, intelligent woman I'd become, not like someone who needed to prove her worth. This was what real relationships looked like, people who supported each other's dreams instead of mocking them, who celebrated successes instead of feeling threatened by them. I went upstairs to my bedroom to get ready for dinner, catching my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, and genuinely happy. She bore little resemblance to the insecure 22-year-old who had left that engagement party in tears 10 years ago. As I chose my outfit for the evening, I thought about the paths our lives had taken. Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had played it safe, choosing conventional careers and conventional thinking. They'd mocked my dreams because those dreams were bigger than anything they could imagine for themselves. But here's what they'd never understood: success isn't just about money or recognition. It's about becoming the person you're meant to be, about pushing through the fear and doubt and criticism to create something meaningful. They'd seen my ambitions as unrealistic because they were projecting their own limitations onto me. When I talked about changing the world through technology, they heard fantasy because they couldn't envision a world where someone like me, someone they saw as less than themselves, could achieve something extraordinary. The saddest part was that if they'd supported me back then, if they believed in me when I needed it most, they could have been part of this journey. I would have gladly brought them along as my companies grew. I would have invested in their dreams and helped them succeed too. Instead, they'd chosen to tear me down, and in doing so, they'd cut themselves off from possibilities they couldn't even imagine. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Maria, my housekeeper, calling from her weekend off. Miss Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you, but there are some people asking questions about you in the neighborhood. They showed me a picture and asked if I knew where you lived. When was this, Maria? About an hour ago. They seemed nice enough, but something felt off about it. They said they were old friends trying to surprise you. I smiled. They already found me, but thank you for the heads up. If anyone else comes around asking questions, please let me know immediately. Of course, Miss Sarah. Have a good evening. After hanging up, I realized that Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had been planning this approach for a while. They'd researched property records, probably spent days figuring out how to trace the ownership back to me, and undoubtedly rehearsed what they were going to say. This wasn't a spontaneous decision born of genuine remorse, it was a calculated move born of desperation. This made me feel even better about how I'd handled the situation. They'd come to my home with an agenda, hoping to manipulate me with nostalgia and fake apologies. Instead, they'd gotten a cold dose of reality from someone who was no longer naive enough to fall for their tactics. I finished getting dressed and headed downstairs to wait for David. Through the kitchen window, I could see the lights of Los Angeles twinkling below, a vast network of dreams and possibilities stretching to the horizon. 20 minutes later, David's car pulled into the driveway. I grabbed my purse and headed outside, locking the door behind me. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing me on the cheek as I got into the passenger seat. "Good day?" "Actually, yes. I'll tell you about it over dinner." As we drove down the winding road that led toward Beverly Hills, I caught a glimpse of the city lights again and thought about all the paths that had led me here. Every rejection, every disappointment, every moment of self-doubt had been necessary to forge the strength I needed to build my empire. The drive gave me time to reflect on something I hadn't thought about in years, the moment when everything truly changed for me. It wasn't when Microsoft bought my first company, or when my second company went public, or even when I bought this house. It was much earlier, about 3 years into building my first app. I'd been invited to speak at a small tech conference in San Diego. Nothing prestigious, maybe 200 people in a hotel conference room, mostly other struggling entrepreneurs and some local investors. But it was my first time being asked to share my story publicly. I remember standing at the podium, looking out at the audience, and suddenly feeling overwhelmed by how far I'd come from that crying session on my studio apartment floor. I wasn't rich yet, wasn't famous, wasn't even profitable. But I had users who genuinely loved what I'd built, employees who believed in our mission, and investors who were betting their money on my vision. During the Q&A, a woman in the front row had raised her hand. "What advice would you give to someone whose friends and family think they're crazy for pursuing an impossible dream?" I'd thought about Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca as I'd answered. "First, make sure you're not actually crazy," I'd said, getting a laugh from the audience. "But if you've done your research, if you understand your market, if you're solving a real problem that real people have, then the only opinion that matters is your customers. Friends and family love you, but that doesn't make them qualified to judge your business ideas." After my talk, that same woman had approached me. She was probably in her 50s, with gray streaked hair and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "I wanted to thank you," she'd said. "My daughter thinks I'm having a midlife crisis because I want to start a catering business. Your talk reminded me that she's never run a business, so why am I letting her opinion stop me?" 6 months later, she'd sent me a Facebook message with photos of her first major catering event. "You changed my life," she'd written. "Not just with your advice, but with your example. If someone young enough to be my daughter can build a tech company from nothing, I can certainly figure out how to cook for rich people." That message had meant more to me than any business award or magazine feature ever could. I'd realized that success wasn't just about proving my doubters wrong, it was about inspiring other people to ignore their doubters too. The memory made me think about something David had said once, about how my real talent wasn't for technology but for seeing potential where others saw obstacles. "You don't just build companies," he'd observed. "You build confidence. In your employees, in your users, in other entrepreneurs who hear your story." Maybe that's what had made Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca so uncomfortable all those years ago. It wasn't just that my dreams were big, it was that my belief in those dreams was unshakable, and that threatened their own carefully constructed limitations. People like certainty. They like to know where they stand in relation to everyone else. My refusal to accept their assessment of what was possible for someone like me had disrupted their entire worldview. If I could succeed despite their predictions, what did that say about their own choices to play it safe? I thought about Marcus specifically, and how he'd reacted when I'd first told him about wanting to start my own company. He'd literally laughed, not in a mean way, but in the way you laugh when a child says they want to be a dinosaur when they grow up. "Sarah, do you know what the startup failure rate is? Do you understand how much money you'd need? How would you even compete with established companies that have whole teams of developers?" Every question he'd asked had been designed to highlight the obstacles rather than explore solutions. He hadn't said, "That's interesting, how would you approach the funding challenge?" Or "What would make your app different from existing solutions?" He'd simply listed reasons why it couldn't work. At the time, I'd interpreted this as concern for my welfare. Now I understood it was actually concern for his worldview. If someone like me, someone he considered less capable than himself, could achieve something extraordinary, then what excuse did he have for not pursuing his own extraordinary dreams? The truth was, Marcus had never had any extraordinary dreams. His biggest ambition was to follow in his father's footsteps and maybe expand the family business slightly. When that path disappeared, he'd been lost because he'd never developed the skill of creating something from nothing. Jessica had been similar, though her limitations were different. She'd been brilliant at understanding what was already popular, what trends were already emerging, what messages would resonate with people who were already primed to hear them. But she'd never shown any ability to see around corners, to anticipate what people would want before they knew they wanted it. Her marketing campaigns were always perfectly executed and completely forgettable. She could make people buy products they already half wanted, but she couldn't create desire for something truly new. When I tried to explain my app concept to her, she fixated on how hard it would be to market something that didn't have an obvious comparison point. People need to understand what category a product fits into, she'd said. If you can't explain it in one sentence using existing reference points, you'll never be able to sell it. But some of the most successful products in history had been impossible to categorize when they first launched. Who was the iPhone competing with when it first came out? BlackBerry? iPod? Digital cameras? The answer was all of them and none of them, because it was creating an entirely new category. My productivity app had faced the same challenge. It wasn't just project management software, or just communication tools, or just time tracking. It was all of those things integrated in a way that made small business operations dramatically more efficient. Jessica couldn't see the vision because she was thinking like a marketer instead of thinking like a user. Rebecca's limitations had been the most personal, because they'd been rooted in insecurity rather than intellectual constraints. She'd had the creative vision to understand what I was trying to build, but she'd been threatened by the possibility that I might actually build it successfully. I remembered a conversation we had during our senior year of college, when I'd first started talking seriously about entrepreneurship. She'd been working on her senior art project, a series of paintings about identity and authenticity in digital spaces. The thing is, she'd said, mixing colors on her palette, everyone thinks they're going to change the world with technology. But most of it just makes people more disconnected from real human experiences. It had been a thoughtful critique, and I'd respected her perspective even though I disagreed with it. But then she'd added, I think you're romanticizing the whole startup thing because it seems more glamorous than getting a regular job like the rest of us. That comment had revealed her true feelings. She wasn't concerned about technology's impact on human connection, she was resentful that I was pursuing a path that might lead to more recognition than her art career would bring. The saddest part was that Rebecca had been genuinely talented. Her paintings had been beautiful and thought-provoking, her insights about art and culture had been sharp and original. If she channeled her creativity and intelligence into supporting my dreams instead of undermining them, she could have been part of something amazing. I'd actually fantasized, in those early days of building my company, about bringing Rebecca in to handle our visual design and user experience work. She would have been brilliant at it, she understood aesthetics and psychology in ways that most designers didn't. But by the time I was in a position to hire her, our friendship was already over. Now she was teaching community college art classes, which wasn't a failure by any objective measure, but it had to feel like one to someone who'd once dreamed of gallery shows and critical acclaim. I wondered if she ever thought about the path not taken, the opportunities she'd missed because she'd been more invested in my failure than in her own success. David squeezed my hand as we pulled into his parents' driveway, bringing me back to the present. You've been quiet, he observed. Still processing the afternoon? Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had played their role in that journey, even if they didn't realize it. Their cruelty had driven me to prove them wrong, their abandonment had taught me self-reliance, and their dismissal of my dreams had motivated me to make those dreams even bigger and more audacious. In a twisted way, I owe them a debt of gratitude. If they'd been better friends, if they'd supported and encouraged me, I might have been content with smaller successes. I might never have pushed myself to achieve everything I'd accomplished. But I wasn't about to share that insight with them. Some lessons are meant to be learned through consequences, and they were finally experiencing the consequences of their choices. At dinner with David's parents, I told them about the unexpected visitors. Dr. Chen shook her head with disapproval. The audacity of showing up at your home unannounced after 10 years of silence, she said. And with obvious ulterior motives. People reveal their true character when they're desperate, Robert added thoughtfully. It sounds like they revealed theirs long ago, and today just confirmed it. David reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of how you handled it. It couldn't have been easy. Actually, it was easier than I expected. I think I needed that closure more than I realized. And it was true. For 10 years, I carried some part of their rejection with me, even as I succeeded beyond their wildest imagination. There had always been a small voice in my head wondering if they'd been right about me, if my success was somehow fraudulent or temporary. But seeing them today, diminished and desperate, had finally silenced that voice completely. I wasn't the failure they'd predicted I would be. They were the ones who had failed to see my potential, failed to support their friend, failed to build the lives they thought they were entitled to. As we drove home that night, David asked, "Do you think you'll hear from them again?" Maybe from Rebecca. She seemed genuinely sorry, and I meant what I said about the foundation. But the other two? I doubt it. Their pride is probably too wounded right now. And if they do contact you again? I smiled, watching the city lights blur past the window. Then I'll handle it the same way I handled today. Calmly, clearly, and with the knowledge that I don't owe them anything. When we got back to my house, I stood in my foyer again, looking up at the crystal chandelier that had witnessed that afternoon's confrontation. The marble floors gleamed in the soft light, and everything felt peaceful and elegant and exactly as it should be. This was my home, my sanctuary, my reward for refusing to let other people's limitations define me. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue building my empire, continue proving that dreams aren't fantasies if you're willing to work hard enough to make them reality. And somewhere across the city, 3 people who had once made me feel small and worthless were probably lying awake wondering how different their lives might have been if they'd chosen to believe in me instead of betting against me. But that was their burden to carry now, not mine. I had finally, completely, irrevocably moved on from needing their approval or validation. The girl they had dismissed as unrealistic and inappropriate had become the woman they now desperately needed help from. And that woman had looked them in the eye, spoken calmly, and watched the color drain from their faces as they realized exactly what they had lost when they decided I wasn't worth their friendship. It was, I thought as I headed upstairs to bed, the most satisfying conversation I'd ever had. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. There's something profoundly liberating about finally closing a chapter that has been left open for too long. As I sipped my coffee on the terrace overlooking the city, I realized that I had been unconsciously holding space for those 3 people in my heart, hoping someday for reconciliation or at least understanding. Now that space was free, and I could fill it with people who actually deserved to be there. My phone buzzed with an email notification. To my surprise, it was from Rebecca Walsh, sent several hours earlier at 3:47 a.m. She must have been up all night thinking about our encounter. Sarah, I know you said to go through official channels, but I wanted to tell you something first. What we did to you is unforgivable, and I've regretted it every day for 10 years. Seeing you yesterday, seeing the incredible life you've built, just made me realize how much we lost when we lost you. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship, I know I don't deserve either. But I wanted you to know that you were always better than we gave you credit for, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. I'll submit a proper proposal to your foundation this week. Thank you for giving me even that much of a chance. Rebecca. I read the email twice, then forwarded it to David with a note. One of them seems to actually get it. He texted back immediately, people can change. Doesn't mean you owe her anything, but it's nice to see real accountability. He was right, of course. Rebecca's email felt different from the calculated performance Jessica and Marcus had put on at my door. This felt like genuine remorse rather than strategic positioning. But it also didn't change anything fundamental. Rebecca had still participated in excluding me from their group, still laughed at my dreams, still contributed to making me feel worthless during one of the most vulnerable periods of my life. The fact that she regretted it now was nice, I supposed. But it didn't entitle her to forgiveness or friendship or any place in my current life. I decided not to respond to the email. If she wanted to submit a proposal to my foundation, she could do it through the proper channels like any other applicant. Her work would speak for itself, and if it was genuinely good for the kids we serve, then we'd consider it. But the personal relationship she was hoping for? That ship had sailed 10 years ago, and no amount of late-night emails could call it back to harbor. As I got dressed for work, I thought about the broader lesson in all of this. Success, I had learned, changes how people see you, but it shouldn't change how you see yourself. I had built my empire not to prove anything to Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca, but to prove something to myself. The validation I had craved from them 10 years ago was meaningless now, because I had found something much more valuable: self-respect earned through achievement, relationships built on mutual admiration rather than need, and the confidence that comes from knowing you can overcome any obstacle if you're willing to work hard enough. They had thought they were superior to me because they had conventional success at a young age. But conventional success had made them conventional people, while my unconventional path had made me extraordinary. Standing in my closet, surrounded by beautiful clothes and expensive shoes and all the material markers of success, I realized that the most valuable thing I owned was something that couldn't be bought: the knowledge that I had taken their worst opinions of me and used them as fuel to become everything they said I could never be. Their visit yesterday hadn't been about seeking forgiveness or rekindling friendship. It had been about seeking salvation from the consequences of their own limited thinking. But some consequences can't be escaped, only endured. And some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. I selected a power suit for my board meeting and smiled at my reflection. The woman in the mirror was strong, successful, and surrounded by people who appreciated her worth. She had everything she needed, and she had earned every bit of it. As I headed downstairs to start another day of building my empire, I realized that Jessica, Marcus, and Rebecca had actually given me one final gift: absolute clarity about who belonged in my life and who didn't. And for that, at least, I was grateful.